Hi everybody, welcome to our guest lecture this week on the new Audacity, and thank you so much for coming online to join us. So I'll just do a short introduction. This event is being hosted by the Centre for Contemporary Literature here at Birkbeck, and of course it's also part of our MA summer programme for the various related contemporary MA programmes that we run. So in addition to our students, there are going to be, I suspect, a number of people attending this session external to Birkbeck. So hi to you all and thank you for coming. With that in mind, I thought it would be worthwhile just doing a quick bit of digital housekeeping so we all understand the etiquette of this session. So the first thing to note is that this session is being recorded as part of our teaching provision. So if you are uncomfortable with that, you may opt to leave, and you can always listen to the recording later. During the lecture, everybody except our speakers are going to be muted. And when we come to the discussion, what we'll do is we'll ask you to raise your hand, and there's a little raise hand button that should be visible to you. And Peter can maybe describe where it is in text chat if that's not obvious. And then when we call out your name, if you want to ask your question in person, you can then turn on your audio and video and we can all see you, but no pressure. You may not want to be seen, of course. But we're equally happy for you to be texting in our text box. So you should all be able to see in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen a number of icons, and the conversation balloon, that's text box, text chat. And if you go on text chat, you'll see that my colleague Peter Fifield has already been moderating that chat, and he will be there for the duration and he can feed your questions back to us. Okay, I hope that's clear for everybody, but do feel free to ask a question in text chat if you're not sure what's going on. So I'm really excited to be able to welcome today Dr. Jennifer Cooke, who's going to be talking to us about the new Audacity. Jennifer is Senior Lecturer in English at Loughborough University, where she chairs the Gendered Lives Research Group. And her recent research has focused on contemporary literature and particularly life writing and poetry. She is, of course, herself a published poet. And she looks at theories of feminism, sexuality, gender, queer and trans theory, and especially focusing on theories of intimacy, affect and the emotions. So this work over a number of years has led to her recent monograph, Contemporary Feminist Life-Writing, which has just come out, I think, in April with Cambridge University Press, and we might even be the first audience to hear about the recently published book. And it's also fed into an edited collection coming out with Cambridge University Press later on this year called New Feminist Studies, 21st Century Critical Interventions. I'm also showing you a couple of images of Jen's earlier book. So her first published monograph, Legacies of Plague in Literature Theory and Film, was published back in 2009, and I wonder if the publishers might be knocking on Jen's door for a new edition at the moment. So it seems very relevant for our own current situation. And she has, of course, also edited a Bloomsbury collection on scenes of intimacy. Okay, so that's Jen. I'm going to hand over to her now with her lecture, which has its own PowerPoint slide. And then I will introduce our other speaker, Dr Katherine Angel, after Jen's lecture. So thank you very much for watching and hope you enjoy. Okay, let's just change the slides over. So Jen, yeah, if you're ready, you can turn on your audio and video.
Here I am. Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me, everybody. It's wonderful to be here in my room. No, it's wonderful to have so many people here and to have this opportunity to talk about my recent work. I want to say a big thank you to Caroline for organising this and to Katherine for joining the discussion later, because she's one of my featured writers that I discuss within the book, and I think that's probably relatively daunting for both of us. And also to Peter for moderating, which is a key skill in these times. I also wanted to do a very quick content warning. I do discuss rape in this talk, not in any detail, although there is more detail in the book. But I am talking about rape narratives in a kind of generalised way. I'm not going into any details, but and structurally, most of this talk is drawn from the introduction to the book, and as such, it provides a lot of the sort of wider arguments that the book makes, although interspersed amongst that material, I provide very short chapter summaries that give you a sort of sense of how I engage with the different material in the different chapters. And the last thing before I really get going is to draw attention to this wonderful image, which is by the artist Hardy, who allowed me to use this for the front cover of the book, which I'm really delighted to have been able to use. Oh, okay. It doesn't have the function of bringing things up individually, I notice. We're not in PowerPoint land quite. Okay, fine. All right. Start on the opening page. The first section then I want to think about how I define audacity in the book. And the book actually starts with an illustrative example from Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure. So Thomas's first wife, the rather sexy and audacious Arabella, throws a pig's penis at him to get his attention. And this is the anecdote with which I start the book. And Jude, Hardy explains, seemed to expect her to explain why she had audaciously stopped him by this novel artillery instead of by hailing him. And Arabella, for me, is an example of the way in which women get labelled as audacious, the way it's a gendered term that gets used to name the brazen, and that's a sort of historically literary example, but we see it again and again as it crops up. And of course their marriage is a predictable failure. So the opprobrium that frequently attaches to audacity has long cast its shadow over women like Arabella, who are deemed shameless. And in such usage, audacity is a moral judgment employed to label and often therefore to exclude, and that's how we see it in Hardy's narrative. We are, from that first anecdote onwards, encouraged to see Arabella as an unsuitable partner for Jude. It gets mobilised then, this usage, or this particular figuration of audacity, as a disapproving sobriquet for those who disobey unspoken rules, like Arabella does, or as whistleblowers do. Audacity is used by those both swimming with and swimming against the tide of norms. And this is my Dominic Cummings content alert. People whose sensibilities are offended by a breach in sanctioned behaviour often reach for audacity as a reproach, as many of us have been recently about Dominic Cummings, whereas those who find norms themselves an offensive constraint, and some argue that Dominic Cummings did, may audaciously seek to breach them. So this is about how audacity can work in both of those modes. It can be used to name the actions of the person who breaches the rules and therefore to condemn them, but it could also be a way of naming the person who breaches, those rules in a good way, that it can be something that you can claim. So in questioning morality, the audacious often can wake up and call forth moral censure. And in this sense, it's often a public challenge to conventions, characterised by a boldness and a disregard for decorum, protocol, or moral restraints. And as such, it can be understood negatively, but not necessarily. Instead, it can be oriented towards the future by enacting a step away from the line and the mass of others. And I think I can call up the slide now, which has some of those on there, as well as the front cover of the book. So if we're using it in this sort of future-facing, bold way, that kind of audacity takes risks with thinking and writing in new ways, and that's often the spirit that I'm using audacity within the book. And in that way, it can appear to be progressive and productive, Clearly why Barack Obama called his book The Audacity of Hope in 2006 when he was just a senator. So it marks a difference from the crowd or the norm. And Audacity, therefore, is political, even when its message doesn't engage directly with politics. What I'm talking about in contemporary feminist life writing is what I'm calling a new audacity, and I'm going to say you see much more about that as we go through, evident in contemporary life writing. And it's this contemporary life writing produced by a number of feminists, many of whom are young. Katherine will be pleased by that one. Towards the beginning of their publishing careers often, or at least they were when I started writing about them and when this book was written, and all of whom experiment by testing the boundaries of autobiographical conventions. So I use life writing broadly to mean autobiography with the slash. Sometimes it's just autobiography, but often autobiography involves biography. So this sort of work has a boldness in style and content, and it often explores difficult and disturbing experiences. For example, in chapter 2, here we go, which is called Ugly Audacities in Autobiography, Genius, Betrayal and Writer's Block. I discussed these three writers, so Alison Bechdel, Sheila Heti and Kate Zambrino. And what interests me, particularly in Zambrino and Bechdel, is their discussion of mental ill health. And also with Heti, alongside Heti, all of them write about the ragged experience of writer's block, and they all refuse to glamorize writing as an occupation. And in the process, they challenge conventional notions of self-authorship. So this particular editor is interested in genius and its gendering. All three of them discuss genius in some way or another. Bechdel actually won the MacArthur Genius Award, or what's commonly known as the Genius Award, for I think just after this book was published, Are You My Mother? And this chapter, is interested in writer's block. Its representation of writing as difficult, as a place where one might encounter ill health, mental ill health, feelings of depression and anxiety. But also I track how in all three books, talking with and engaging with another woman or the work of another woman. So for Bechdel, it's her therapist and her mother. For Zambrino, it's the mad modernist wives, the writing about the mad modernist wives that she's interested in. So she's Zelda Fitzgerald and some of the figures that you can see actually on the front of her book there. And for Heti, it's her best friend. So these conversations break the impasse of writer's block and move them into artistic autonomy, help them become people who are not dependent anymore on anxiety, but who can move into a new space. And at the close of that chapter, I engage with Rita Felsky's ideas of recognition compared to a more Freudian idea of identification. The next chapter that I'm going to talk about is actually chapter 1. And this is an example of the work of these three writers, Tracy Emin, Yana Leo and Virginie Despentes, and all three of them write about their rapes and the men who have raped them. Not all of their texts are solely about that. For Leo, that is the case, but for Despentes and Emin, those are just parts of what's happening in their books. But what interests me about these texts, among other things, is the position that they act, which is that of the silenced victim. And there's audacity in that rejection, in that speaking out alone. But their audacity is also evident in how they write about their rapes and how, as I argue, this becomes a form of feminist praxis. So what I explore in relation to Emin is the way that she names and shames, actually in advance of the naming and shaming that we see more commonly now. Emin was doing it when this book was just published right at the beginning of the 2000s. And I also discuss the way they all write rape. They write it slightly differently, but there's a tendency to write with very clear, crystalline prose, and also to be drawn again and again to the same material. So all three of these writers have written about their rapes in various different forms. So it's something that has drawn them back to write about again and again in different forms and different projects. I think you can see that there's a certain audacity in the covers of these books sometimes, and so Rape New York, there is a picture of the bed in her house where she was raped, and it's dated, it's got a police sticker because she took photographs after the event and then submitted them to the police, and later she also used them in a exhibition. So this chapter discusses how these writers use the effective intensity of their experiences and of writing about their experiences, and of how that will affect the reader, to then also make powerful arguments about the social ills of misogyny and the gendered implications of urban planning, particularly in the case of Leo, that's oriented towards profitability and no care for community security. So Despentes and Leo are very far from the script for the stranger rapes that they experienced. Often stranger rapes are framed in the media and the popular imagination as placing the unlucky woman in the wrong place at the wrong time, but that still partially makes her to blame, and that's roundly rejected by these writers. But they refuse to see rape as solely just a personal tragedy. They see it as a consequence of addressable social and political problems. And that's Leo and Despentes who see them in that way. Emin is much quieter politically, but nevertheless shares various elements in terms of the writing with these other authors. So New Audacity authors value non-normative desires and intimacies and lovers, and they disrupt how we inhabit the world and how others react to them inhabiting the world as well. They're interested in sex and they write about it. They own their urges, even if some of them might be labelled as perverse. And so this is the lineup for chapter 3, where I discuss I Love Dick by Chris Kraus, Katherine Angel's Unmastered, and Calloway's you haven't got quite, you can't see the title there, Mary Calloway's What Purpose Do I Serve in Your Life? So Angel and Calloway chronicle their desire for submission to men and the responses this causes in themselves and others. In I Love Dick, Kraus insists on the validity of her emotional fall into an intensity of feeling for a man she barely knows, a man who continues to behave poorly towards her. Others in the book also write about sex. Others that I discuss in the book also write about sex. So Maggie Nelson begins the Argonauts with her hot enjoyment of being anally penetrated by Harry, her trans lover. And Paul Preciado describes how transformative sex is with Virginie Despentes. So you can see already that there's a link there between two of my writers. Considerably less ebullient are Juliet Jakes' accounts of her sexual intimacies that turn awkward and that disappoint. Despentes and Calloway also discuss their sex work and its emotional complexity. And as Melissa Gira Grant says of sex workers who testify to their experiences, quote, part of telling the truth here is refusing to conform the story to narrow roles, virgin, victim, wretch or whore, that she did not originate herself. So from those who sell sex to those who take sex hormones, the authors I discuss in Contemporary Feminist Life-Writing tend to be impatient with binary thinking, with categories that pin them down or pathologize them. New Audacity writers are experimenters in life and in the art of telling it. So the new in New Audacity seeks to capture how these writers offer fresh perspectives on their contemporary lives, on feminism in the early 21st century, and how they do so in new experiments with genre. My chosen texts are written and structured to maximize the effective impact of the feminist politics that they contain. So the formal properties of this writing deliberately amplifies the questions they raise and the arguments they propound, and this is often achieved through their experiments with literary conventions. So I close read the text, analyse how they curate and create effective encounters in order to unsettle assumptions about sexuality, desire, sex work, the eroticism of female submission, trans lives, mental ill health, rape, and feminism itself. So new Audacity feminists use their writings to think from life. This has formal implications. Preciado, Leo, and Jakes adopt an alternating structure so that primarily factual and theoretical chapters are interspersed with chapters about their lives. For others, including Nelson, Angel, Zambrino, Krauss, and Despont, life events, both quotidian and disruptive, propel reflection, a process that repeatedly tracks from individual personal experiences to thinking through their collective and political implications. However, and I think this is really important in relation to feminist scholarship, these are not simply unstructured associations for any of these writers. On the contrary, these texts are really structured. So what might initially appear to be loose and undirected association actually under closer scrutiny turns out to be deliberately deployed associative strategies. This is the case with how Bechdel's chapters each unfold from a dream and unpick its significance. It's the case with the dialogic method Zambrino uses to highlight similarities between her own life and those of the modernist women she writes of, and with Nelson's paralleling of pregnancy and transition, her interweaving of death and the labour of birth. Variations on the essay are favourite forms among new Audacity writers, especially with those making overt interventions into politicised debates, as do Leo, Preciado, and Despont. Other forms in evidence are the poetic layout of Angel's precise lyrical prose, Emin's poem and handwritten notes, Krauss's epistles, Vanessa Place's conceptual poetry, Bechdel's graphic memoir, Hetty's novel from life, and the overwritten photos and screenshots used by Calloway. Across them all, the imbrication of life with intellectual ideas, questions, and arguments is a defining feature. So I have just some examples here to underline the formal diversity of the techniques being used here. So you can see here, and they're probably not big enough for you to actually see, but you can see in Katherine Angel's work how this is laid out on the page, often in a very sparse way. There's a lot of blank text, a lot of blank page, and often very particular phrases that are picked out upon it. We can see covers that are relatively audacious. I love Dick, provoking various comments. If anyone's read it in public, you'll maybe have experienced that. This is Emin's handwritten note that she includes in her book. I won't read it out, but she's got her recognisable signature there. In Hetty's How Should a Person Be, there are sections that are laid out like this, as though they are perhaps a play. She is at the time trying to write a play, and so these are transcripts of records of her conversations with Margot, her friend. This is the cover that I was talking about from Jana and Leo. Again, interesting use of her own personal materials. This is a double frame from Bechdel's Are You My Mother, or double page spread. So it's a graphic memoir. She's done another one. She did a Fun Home earlier, and this one, which was about her father, this one's about her mother, but you can see there's interesting formal challenges to that work. And this finally comes from Mary Calloway's What Purpose Do I Serve in Your Life? So she's got screenshots there that she's pulled off the net and redacted names from. She's got pictures with reviews of her work put over the top of them. So Mary Calloway is a lazy, boring writer who I know through a friend to be histrionic, predictably unpredictable, and most likely autistic. Who cares? So somebody's written that on the internet about her, and she's taken that and transposed it onto a picture of herself. So there are all sorts of different formal choices that are going on in this work, many of them bending and challenging the conventions of your usual autobiography that starts at the beginning of a life and goes through to the end of it. So, as is no doubt now clear, we can do a quick recap of what this new Audacity writing is. Boldness in style and content, experimental with genre and its conventions, especially those pertaining to autobiography, often exploring difficult and distinct experiences, so writer's block, struggle with mental health, writing about rape, writing about sex and sex work, and there is an impatience with binary thinking and with categories that pin down and pathologize, and a resistance of victimhood. Again, these are all broad brush strokes, so different authors will conform to this list more than others, and some characteristics more than others, and so on. But this is just to give you the general idea. So, as is probably clear now, the terrain these writers are occupying, and even perhaps the lives they lead, at least from what we can tell in their work, can be considered to be interventions into long-standing but continuing debates within feminism, especially, although not exclusively, Anglo-American feminism. In these new Audacity texts, trans people's lives and identities are not a matter for dispute. Rather, they are valued contributors to feminism. Sex work is discussed as bodily labour, not as a stigmatised blemish upon woman's reputation. Sexual submission is explored with curiosity and does not debar one from being a feminist. So new Audacity writers challenge discourses of victimhood that damage women's agency. They believe it's not just men, but women and sometimes feminists that need to change in order to address misogyny and discrimination. And they often demand large-scale social and structural change rather than placing their hopes in reform. They are usually determined to break with conservative thinking where they find it. And these writers have a lot to say to and about contemporary feminism. So my book, Contemporary Feminist Life-Writing, seeks to define the shape of their feminism, and in so doing to enact a feminist reshaping, especially within literary feminist scholarship and life writing. And I think we can see these writers as part of a resurgence of feminism in the 21st century, which we can see typified in things like Me Too, but also the fact that leaders of something like Black Lives Matter are women, the prevalence of things like the Everyday Sexism Project, and so on. In Contemporary Feminist Life-Writing, I define feminism really broadly as applicable to writers who critically draw attention to or analyse and thereby challenge the gender inequality and patriarchal privileges which adversely affect those who identify as women. This inclusive definition allows the book to feature trans feminist theorising of Preciado, whose contributions to feminism are both informed and insightful. A considerable amount of Preciado's Testo Junkie, as discussed in Chapter 4, is dedicated to exploring gender and the legacies of feminism. He demonstrates, for example, that cis women and trans people's entanglements with hormones, whether to repress the reproductive cycle or change gender, are part of the same pharmaceutical history. The inclusion of Preciado here illustrates the pragmatic dimension of eschewing the category women's writing in my title in favour of feminist. Not all feminism is the same, however. Preciado warns that feminism functions or can function as an instrument of normalisation and political control when it reduces its subject to women, and that's in women in scare quotes. He's summarising the work of Teresa de Lauretis, but theorists such as Judith Butler and Lee Gilmore have long warned against the false universalising that the term woman can enact by flattening out differences between women and their circumstances within social structures and geographical locations. So Chapter 4, Breaking the Binaries, explores contemporary writing by and about trans lives and how they resist or try to reconfigure trans tropes. So the trans tropes I'm drawing on are identified by Jay Prosser in his book From I think, at the end of the 20th century. So these tropes are things like the wrong body narrative and the idea of transition as a journey, and a variety of others that he identifies. So I'm looking at how these writers are rewriting and reconfiguring the autobiographical trans narrative, or writing about trans people. And all three of them are resistant to binary thinking, not just about gender, but lots of different forms of binary thinking. Nelson expands the term trans through her borrowed and in turn expanded theorization of the Argo that she conducts in the Argonauts. I actually criticise Nelson for committing the sin she accuses queer theory of committing by glamorising gay sex. Nelson's probably the most well-known and well-reviewed of all of these three writers. Preciado's Testo Junkie is less well-known in the public sphere, quite well-known amongst academics, I think. So Preciado explores pharmacology and gender experiments, and during the text experiments with testosterone. Preciado argues that all women should do drag king workshops and that there should be a hormones commons. And I think it's notable that there's a lot of critical thinking writing, which is able to criticize the present moment, and not many critical thinkers offer solutions to those problems. Preciado does. We can then assess whether we agree with those particular ideas, but I think his writing is remarkable for doing that. And then discuss Juliet Jakes's trans memoir, probably most traditional of the three texts here. But there's a quiet humanism at work in Jakes's writing, I think, and also a really important de-dramatization of trans lives. And I'm really interested in this de-dramatization. Nelson and Preciado are quite, they dramatize their sexual experiences and so on. And of course, there is the lurid attention that's paid to trans bodies in the press, particularly trans women's bodies in the press. And I think Jakes's writing works really well to counter that. Okay, so feminist autobiography that experiments with the genre's conventions isn't new, and it's important to acknowledge that even if the umbrella term life writing has only come to prominence in the 21st century, this kind of genre-breaking writing has been going on for quite some time. So from the 1980s onwards, we had feminist scholars who criticised the canon of autobiography for its male focus and addressed the lacunae through an efflorescence of studies. There's a lot of autobiography and writing, feminist scholarship of autobiography from the 1980s onwards. These earlier scholars of women's autobiography fought against a doubled discrimination, contesting the relegation of women's writing below that of men's, and then the routine dismissal of autobiography as a minor genre, far below narrative fiction and poetry in literary importance. The centrality of feminism in valorising autobiographical writing for testifying to the political and the personal can't be overestimated. In large part, it is the body of work resulting from this insight that propelled auto/biography into sharper theoretical and literary focus in the latter decades of the 20th century. As Laura Marcus writes, quote, "The confessional text of autobiographical self-revelation was a dominant form in the 1970s, with major feminist theorists such as Kate Millett redefining autobiography in narratives which combined the close record of daily life with the thematics of feminist liberation and self-discovery," close quotes. This confessional style of writing is what Rita Felsky analyses in Beyond Feminist Aesthetics. Marcus's auto/biography additionally argued that biography is never free from an entanglement with autobiography, and the range of feminist writing in the 1970s and 80s demonstrated that hybridity was central to women probing the boundaries demarking genres. As another leading scholar of women's autobiography, Lee Gilmore, has rightly pointed out, many of the most radical of these hybrid texts of the period were produced by women of colour. So we have Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings in 1969, Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior in 1976, Audre Lorde's Zami, A New Spelling of My Name in 1982, and various others too that Gilmore talks about. So these texts, Gilmore says, verging into autobiographical fiction, the SM manifesto and graphic memoir and comics, connected submerged histories of violence to contemporary trauma and brought both to view. So I think we can see there that some of the forms that the new Audacity writers are reaching for and employing have a history there. They've been used before. So clearly there are close affinities in both subject matter and experimentation with genre between these earlier feminist writers and their new Audacity descendants. But I argue there's a specific 21st century focus to the concerns of contemporary new Audacity writers. So there's the slide that just analyses some of that or reproduces some of that. Gilmore's list of authors is an ethnically diverse set of second wave American feminists. By contrast, the writers in contemporary feminist life writing are drawn from Britain, Canada, the United States, and Europe, although it is American authors who are in the majority, a result of more small presses in the US dedicated to nurturing, encouraging, and publishing feminist and innovative life writing. And I should probably add as well that since I started writing the book, and this is obviously one of the problems and pitfalls of the contemporary, there has been far more of this kind of writing published. So when I first started writing it, there was not as much as there is now, and I think things like the success of Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts and so on has meant that publishers have felt happier to publish this kind of work. But when I first started studying them, there were a relatively small handful of these writers, and obviously my choice of them is determined by various factors, some of which are to do with personal preference, some of which are to do with keeping it away from poetry, which I can talk about later if you wish me to. But one of the other things is to do with the networks. So the networks among younger new Audacity writing life writers evince in a digital age that they're more connected with each other than they were 40 or 50 years ago. So 40 or 50 years ago, many of the writers would have remained monadic outsiders, not necessarily aware of each other or not necessarily in dialogue with each other in the same way that we are now. So small presses in the past could remain unknown outside of their national or even regional contexts, whereas contemporary websites and social media make finding, purchasing and advertising an author's work easy, cheap or even free, more or less free. Another thing that marks the writers is transnational migration. So Leo and Preciado are Spaniards who reside respectively in New York and France, for example. And there is ethnic diversity among the writers I discuss. So Calloway is American, part Korean, Tracy Emin is British and part Turkish, Bechdel, Hetty and Krauss are Jewish. But when these writers comment upon their ethnicity, it is not, as it was for the earlier writers' Gilmore lists, central to the writing projects, to their writing projects, or their stated reasons for reaching for unusual or blended forms, although some have gone on to write about their ethnicity since the text that I'm discussing here. So writers like Audre Lorde and Hong Kingston were the original audacious feminist life writers, breaking new ground formally and shifting the parameters of feminist autobiography to include accounts of how women from minority ethnicities found and forged their identities in often racist and hostile environments. New Audacity writers are similarly attempting to loosen the circumference of feminist discourse, but this time to ask for space to be made for sex workers and trans people, for conversations about ambivalent desires for sexual submission, about mental ill health, and how to survive rape without victimhood. Unlike their second wave predecessors, they write in the wake of gender, queer, and trauma theory, post-structuralist and Derridian critiques of binary thinking, and accept that identity is both socially constructed and thus circumscribed by norms, and that it has material and embodied manifestations and consequences attendant upon historical circumstances. Curiously, new Audacity writers Zambrino, Krauss and Despont repeat a familiar lament, the echo of which has continued to rebound from the pens of women writing about their lives from the 1970s to the present. Audre Lorde's 1978 essay, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action, is one of the classic calls for women to speak openly about their lives. It closes by claiming that, quote, "it is not difference which immobilizes us, but silence. And there are so many silences to be broken," close quote. A Riot Girl flyer, most likely from the 1990s, makes a similar claim. Quote, "because we need to talk to each other. Communication inclusion is key. We will never know if we don't break the code of silence, because we girls want to create mediums that speak to us," close quote. Just before the turn of the millennium, Chris Kraus writes, "There's not enough female irrepressibility written down. I feel my silence and repression with the entire female gender's silence and repression. I think the sheer fact of women talking, being, paradoxical, inexplicable, flip, self-destructive, but above all else, public, is the most revolutionary thing in the world," close quote. As part of a programme to redress this perceived illusion, Krauss publishes Zambrino's Heroines. In turn, Zambrino comments of a woman in her creative writing class, quote, "the shame and guilt for writing her life, for living her life, the self-censoring violence, a silencing campaign. She feels she cannot write of her breakdown, of her interior state. She is fearful of being psychologized, pathologized, placed somewhere on the DSM." And at the end of King Kong Theory, Despont writes, quote, "of course it's difficult to be a woman. Fears, constraints, being commanded to silence, called to a long discredited line of order, a whole carnival of pathetic and sterile limitations." Together, these statements build into a curious paradox. It is apparent that women have been making a noise about being silenced for many decades now. To speak, even to encounter other feminists speaking, is evidently not sufficient to dispel the sensation of being silenced. On the one hand, there is now a considerable archive of feminist writing that documents both the repeated calls to speak and write against silence, and the evidence that feminists, authors, activists, and academics alike have been repeatedly doing so. One obvious conclusion to draw is that a clear audience and market exists for feminist work, even if that is primarily composed of other feminists, as the ongoing success of the feminist press demonstrates. It's worth noting too that the silence referred to by the writers I quote above is variegated, pertaining to different experiences of race, class, mental health, and subcultural gender sidelining, and resultantly the strategies for dealing with it range from self-censure to zine making. The silences they complain of are imposed by external cultural and social norms and codes of propriety. On the other hand, there is evidence that literary writing, whether explicitly feminist or not, does not have pervasive cultural penetration. Statistics report that men are less likely to read and to review literary fiction written by women, and of active readers interested in popular fiction, women tend to read women and men to read men. Feminist conferences are attended overwhelmingly by women. Academic conferences on women's writing feature all women participants with a depressing frequency. The small presses favoured by many new Audacity writers further limits the readership to which they are likely to be exposed, or at least in the first instance. So quite a few of the writers that I'm talking about are published first of all in a smaller press outlet and then picked up by a larger press and republished. In the context of avant-garde art, Lauren Ballant rightly argues that preaching to the choir is not without its merits in sustaining solidarity among marginalised groups, to hold open the potential to imagine together different political lives. But Zambrino, Krauss, and Despont complaints about the silencing of women can be placed in the context of a culture where men routinely do not pay much attention to women's writing, a fact which frustrates new Audacity writers. Silencing, then, is not always the result of a conscious strategy of oppression, but can be achieved by men simply ignoring women's writing so that it gains less coverage and has a weaker social and cultural impact. Literary networks are often decisive in helping writers with shared commonality find and support one another, and this is the case with new Audacity writers. To give a not exhausted list that testifies to the connections between the writers I discuss, Hetty interviewed Jakes for the end of Jakes' book Trans and reviewed Zambrino's heroines in the Review of Books. Angel has written about Krauss and teaches Jakes Trans, I think still does, we can check that. Despont and Preciado dated one another, and both their books that I discuss are published by the Feminist Press, as is Leo's Rape New York. Nelson quotes Preciado in The Argonauts. Place wrote a blurb for Leo's book, and Krauss's I Love Dick is published by Semiotext, her husband's Avant-Garde Press, which she now co-edits, or her ex-husband's Avant-Garde Press, which she now co-edits, and which also published Zambrino's Heroines. So whilst not all these authors know each other directly, they're connected by degrees through literary friendships, reviews and publishing circles. Not all of them, though. Tracy Emin is an outlier, clearly connected into her own artistic circles. And Calloway doesn't really seem to be in touch with other writers or blurbing them or whatever in quite the same way. Or grouped among them. Her book's not that well known. Even Sheila Hetty, How Should a Person Be, started out with a small Canadian outfit, the House of Anansi Press, before it was republished by the global Harville Secker in a slightly modified form. So we might think of this preference for small press publishing among so many of these writers in the same terms Zambrino uses of herself. She says, I've begun to cultivate this status as an outsider. I think when I first started writing, there were more outsiders than they are now. I think many of them become mainstreamers. But in their exploration of unsettling topics and in their choices of form, genre and publisher, as well as in the fact that their writing is not often able to support them fully financially, this book's authors comprise a loose group of outsiders, or what might usefully be termed an outsider archive. Within the archive, there are surprising levels of network links between them, testifying to supportive interconnections within this field of life writing. If they are outsiders to mainstream literary publishing, or if some of them are, new Audacity writers are nevertheless rich in cultural capital, with various involvements in academia, journalism, reviewing, readings, literary commentary, and small press publishing. All of that said, it's important to remember, especially in front of Katherine, that the new Audacity, like the new Sincerity and other types of literary grouping, are designations used by academics attempting to capture emergent literary moods or cultural trends. Not all writers I'm classing as part of the new Audacity may agree with or welcome the label. Maybe none of them will, or do. So perhaps, in fact, one writer couldn't deny the charge at all of being audacious. And this is the author of Chapter 5, and this is where I'm going to finish. So Chapter 5 discusses Vanessa Place's Contradictory Feminism. And this is a chapter that returns to the topic of rape. Like Emin, Vanessa Place is one of contemporary feminist life-writing's more notorious authors, and as Calloway does, she deliberately elicits strong reactions from her audiences. So I examine the Tragedia, which is the 3 books you can see on the screen, and in these 3 volumes, she reproduces court reports that are written as part of her job as an appellant attorney for convicted rapists and paedophiles. So she tends to argue for the shortening of their sentences. Very rarely or never is she arguing for them to get off, but more just to lower the life sentences, which are often like in the hundreds of years in the US, or perhaps to get them out of a psychiatric facility and into a normal prison. And she has a variety of justifications for why she works for these people. instead of perhaps for the rape victims on the other side. And this project, Tragedy, which uses her court work, has been hailed by poetry scholars as a work of audacious feminism in holding up a mirror to the ugliness of violence against women. In my chapter, I provide a careful comparison of one of the cases that she covers in the book with the original legal appeals documentation, which I got from the US, and also with another non-poetic work by Place, The Guilt Project, Rape, Morality and the Law, which is her book, which argues for the way that she wants to see the law. I argue that Place's conceptual audacity complicates and works against her stated politics as it emerges in the Guilt Project, vis-a-vis the sex workers in the trial, in the case I'm particularly looking at. Place provides a curated encounter with traumatic material, one which raises ethical questions about Audacity's role in furthering an author's reputation and how that interacts with her stated feminist position. All of the authors featured in Contemporary Feminist Life-Writing are open to the accusation that their audacity is in the service of their reputation rather than their art. But Place is a writer who can easily be accused of trading on the tragedy of others in the service of an audacity which, while it attracts a great deal of attention to her as an author, fails to adhere to coherent feminist principles. I use this final chapter then to explore the complicated ambivalences and contradictions in the politics of one particularly contentious new Audacity writer. Taken together and as a whole, these chapters provide a guide to the contours of new Audacity writing, its stakes, its politics, its contradictions, and its challenges to contemporary orthodoxies. Thank you.
Fab. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Let me just get back to our slides. It's so weird not to have a round of applause, but please know that we're all clapping back at home. Someone's clapping. I'm just going to take the opportunity now to introduce Katherine Angel, who is going to be an important interlocutor here with us. So some of you may already know Dr. Katherine Angel because she is, of course, one of our colleagues at Birkbeck and is the director of the MA in Creative and Critical Writing. But perhaps uniquely for our purposes here, as Jennifer mentioned, she is also a published author in her own right, who forms one of the case studies, I think in chapter 3 of the New Audacity. So Katherine has a PhD from Cambridge University in the history of psychiatry and sexuality, and her first published work was Unmastered, a book on desire most difficult to tell, which obviously Jennifer writes about, and also I think it's really interesting that it was the first work and it was an incredibly audacious volume. More recently, Katherine has published Daddy Issues with Peninsula Press, and we're extremely grateful that she's joining us tonight because she's got a deadline, I think on Monday, for the final edits of her book manuscript, which is titled Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again, and that's going to be published with Verso in 2021. So Katherine, can I ask you to turn on your audio and video and maybe to join us?
Yeah, I've done that. Hello.
Perfect. Hi. So, and Jen, we've got your video and audio, and hopefully we've got mine, and Peter's around there as well. Okay, so what we're going to do, everybody, is I'm going to kind of chair a discussion between Katherine and Jen for a little time, and then obviously you can be sending in your questions through the chat box to Peter, and we can put them directly to these two fabulous women. So I think firstly I wanted to ask perhaps a question to both of you, which you will have no doubt slightly different responses to, and that is this idea of vulnerability and victimhood. So both of you write, Jen in the scholarly way, I guess, and Katherine in the creative critical text, which is Unmastered is obviously beautifully lyrical and beautifully written and very sparse. Can we say something then about this difficult tension between showing vulnerability, whether of one's sexual desires or of one's kind of political role or level of kind of subjective control in any situation, and whether the ability to show vulnerability rather than being forced into that victimhood position is in itself a form of strength. Maybe Katherine, do you want to go first? Because it is sort of the main part about your book, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's very funny because I wrote this book like 10 years ago.
Yeah, sorry.
I had to kind of try and recast myself into the person who was writing then, but also it's really interesting to look back on it now and to hear people like Jen talking about it kind of retrospectively. So I think what I was trying to do at the time was partly to try and loosen a bit that distinction between strength and vulnerability, and between activity and passivity, and these kinds of attitudes or poses that are ascribed to women, often in very judgmental terms, or also in praiseful terms. So it's clear what you're supposed to want to be. You're supposed to want to be on the side of strength, for instance, or power, rather than on the side of weakness and vulnerability. In lots of kind of public discourse about women. And I think when I was writing Unmastered, I really felt troubled by how polarized those things were in the kind of contemporary public domain. So at the time, if you kind of think back to that time, there was a lot of stuff about pornography and sexualization. So reports on sexualization, lots of books about pornography, and sort of feminist texts that were, I think, trying to look back at post-feminism and say, oh, we actually went wrong. And people like Ariel Levy and Natasha Walter were writing these books that were about how sex was now becoming something women had to perform, and to their own harm in a way. So you had that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you had this kind of public discourse that was always so much about strength and sort of being no nonsense and sensible, and kind of that encouraged this sort of idealized pose of mastery, which I think is so much part of kind of mainstream public discourse around anything, to be honest. And so I felt really caught between those two poles, and it felt to me so utterly alien to my experience of what it was like, not just to be a woman, not just to be somebody who experiences sexual desire, but just the experience of being a person. Felt that those stark choices they're never fully realized in any moment in a life. That you need to find a way to articulate the spaces in between. And that's sort of what I think, if I remember rightly, I was trying to do.
Yeah, so in the chapter, I frame the beginning through that debate in about BDSM, right? So the academic debates about BDSM don't have very much space for heterosexual desires for submission that are, on the one hand, you have everything sex positive, and it's great, and you can choose anything, you can be penetrated by anything, you can penetrate anything, everything is fine. And on the other hand, you have women just being dupes, being that any kind of submissiveness is an enactment that pleases misogyny. And I think that encapsulates some of what Catherine's talking about there, the sort of strong woman who can choose versus the woman who's just a sort of dupe or a victim of the patriarchy and hasn't realised it yet. And I think, again, like Katherine said, those debates are not very helpful, but also the fact that they're polarised so much tell us that there's a real squeamishness around being able to explore heterosexual desire for submission by women. And all of the authors that I talk about are interested in submission in one way or another, not always in the same ways. And I think theory has had quite a bit to say about this in its own way. So Leo Bisani's the theorist that I tend to come back to in thinking about this, and his idea of sex as self-shattering. Now he's talking about gay sex between men, but I think he captures something there, and he's coming from a Freudian background. And Lee Edelman uses the same kind of language as well, actually, but I think not as effectively. But then, but that kind of idea that sex, whether it's submissive or not, might actually force us into a position of vulnerability. And I think Katherine writes really beautifully about this, about how we expose ourselves to the other person in our desire, and that in itself is a vulnerability, regardless of, you know, whether you're on top or not, or whether you're a top or a bottom in Bassani's discussion. So and he joins a few others like Sontag, Susan Sontag, who writes about how sex can be existentially, you know, it can be something that really troubles you at your core. And I saw the work of Katherine and these other writers as occupying that difficult ground, thinking about sex in these ways, thinking about vulnerability as something that you enter into, you might want to invite, you might want to play with, that you might want to inhabit, but you also might want the other person to inhabit too, and that in fact various roles might cause both of you to be vulnerable. And I think Katherine writes about that beautifully, also very dialogically, about how one person's strength might prop up another person's vulnerability at a particular moment, and vice versa.
And Katherine, if I may, because I'm sure we're probably all thinking it, how does it feel to be included in this literary grouping of new Audacity writers? Is this something that you would welcome? Does it not really matter to you? That's fine. People can go and talk about that, but you're doing your thing. Do you want to respond to that?
You know, I don't know. It's interesting. I find it really I mean, obviously, I find it fascinating to hear people talk about my work, you know, and especially, I mean, you know, I've talked to lots of people over the years about the book, but it's interesting hearing Jen talk about it in you know, a sort of academic text, and putting my work together with these various other writers, which I think, you know, the writing does kind of naturally sit with a lot of those different writers. But it's true that in a sense, I mean, it doesn't matter to me in a sense how it's kind of, no, that's not true. Of course, it matters to me how it's talked about. But, you know, when you're writing something, you're writing it for the writing, and obviously you're writing it within this context, you know, huge context of, you know, political and literary, cultural kind of constraints and ideas that it's in constant interaction with. But of course, you know, when I was writing that book, I wasn't sort of thinking about where it sat particularly in relation to other writers. I mean, I say, of course, I don't know if that's, maybe that it feels different to other writers, but for me, you know, the motivation was really about something that I felt I needed to articulate, because I didn't feel that I could sort of see it in the kind of popular culture in a way. You know, the writing was very informed by things I was reading, and, you know, which was ranging from Virginia Woolf to, you know, contemporary stuff. I mean, you know, I was reading across a lot of time, but of course I wasn't sort of imagining situating myself in a particular sort of scholarly way of thinking about the writing. If anything, that really came after, when I, you know, saw the kind of reception of the book, and then started to see these other writers that were emerging at the same time or afterwards. And then the landscape really changed. I mean, that's what, you know, Jen, it's so interesting when you were saying about you know, the time that's elapsed, and how all these different writers' careers have kind of changed over time. When I was writing Unmastered, there weren't really books like that being published after by kind of mainstream publishers. Of course, you know, of course, there has always been writing that takes the kind of form that Unmastered does, or that the Argonauts does, or whatever. And there have always been women grappling with that question of, you know, speaking about silence, which is such an interesting thing I'd like to come back to if we can. But in sort of mainstream publishing, there were just not books like that, and that has changed hugely. So, you know, clearly something did happen, and I think, you know, Jen grouping together these different writers is really you know, it's really on point, as they say. But it's amazing how quickly things change, because 10 years ago, I mean, you know, most publishers felt they couldn't publish. I mean, some publishers hated the book, so they didn't want to publish it because they hated it, or, you know, some were indifferent. But some publishers said, we just don't know how to market a book like this, because it's not really memoir and it's not fiction, so there's nowhere for it, you know. And, you know, it's not as if we have abandoned genre altogether, but there's much more space now in bookshops to kind of place books like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jen, back to that. Because I know Peter's been collecting some comments. Yeah, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, I just thought I'd come in at this point because there's been a couple of questions which touch on the this question of positioning, relating Katherine's work and the work of others to neighbouring movements, and articulating a little bit more extensively how these works, how the new Audacity might sit against other categories which have currency. So the first along those lines was a question which really touched on a different form entirely, and that was poetry. And Ian asked, it would be interesting to relate this discussion to poetry and the idea of the girlesque. And then only a few minutes ago, Rachel had another kind of positioning question and said, I was interested in the brief comparison of new Audacity and new sincerity, and was interested if Jennifer sees any stronger connections there. So, for example, can the new Audacity be also described as a post something? Is the new Audacity at all conceived as positioned against or after postmodernism? I thought this was maybe a good moment to bring that in, because we're talking about the relationship of books to one another and of categories to one another. So that's perhaps more oriented towards Jen, I think, but Katherine, I'm sure will have things to say about it as well.
Yeah, so as I said in the talk, some of the choices about who to write about were my personal choices, and as a poet and as somebody who teaches poetry, I wanted not to write about poetry. Partly, I think, for perhaps a rather simplistic reason, which is that I spend most of my working life teaching poetry, trying to get my students to avoid the immediate assumption that the lyric I is confessional, and then to write a book that read it that way or discussed it in that way just seemed to me to be a shame and to be the kind of work I didn't really want to be doing. But certainly the work of someone like Nat Raha, or, to be honest, Citizen, would work really well in this book, thinking about life writing with Citizen. So definitely I think poetry could be brought into it. I just didn't feel like I was the person to do that. I do discuss the new sincerity in the introduction, and I cut that out of the talk for time reasons, but I go through there why the kind of irony which Adam Kelly, particularly, who's the new sincericist labeler, why his sort of focus on irony doesn't really work for these writers. I think the commitments of the new Audacity writers, it's not about irony, it's not about pastiche either, and I think that's partly perhaps answers the postmodern question too, that there's something else going on in this writing. And I do touch on it a little bit, but the ideas of authenticity and authorship are at work in the writing, but not necessarily authenticity as here's my soul, I lay it bare, but more of an authenticity of commitment to a certain type of writing or a certain type of articulation of women's experience, perhaps. So, and I do sort of feel like as well, and this is perhaps a glib thing to say, but that, you know, writing about postmodernism is still writing about postmodernism, and I don't want to write about postmodernism.
Bravo. Could I just follow up with a question of my own, which I think is relevant to what you've just been saying, certainly in terms of the terminology that you're using. A figure looms large in this discussion, but her name has not been mentioned, and that's de Beauvoir. Talked about authenticity and about commitment and about sincerity. That was, I know that her dedication and interest to autobiography, innovative autobiography, is in the kind of prehistory to the one you gave us. But I wonder whether you could articulate a little bit more how that that kind of wave of feminism fits into this much more up-to-date account of self-examination, of revelation, of rebellion, of some of those really kind of animating, liberating forces.
Yeah, I think de Beauvoir's been sidelined actually intellectually. I think for various reasons, partly philosophers have all turned to Sartre instead, and the feminists. She was, you know, I think that the feminine écriture that came along sort of swept her aside somewhat and overtook that legacy. And she is important, and she is actually extremely wide-ranging. Most people only know the second sex rather than, you know, there was quite a large body of work which tends to remain unrecognised, and I think is due very possibly for someone to come along and work on that. But how that fits into the writers that I'm thinking about, I mean, I think some of them probably, well, I always think this about de Beauvoir. I suspect if I went round to everyone's house who I've written about, they'd probably have the second sex on their shelves, but they might not draw on it. And the touchstone is much more likely to be Virginia Woolf, who lots of the writers do refer to. And I think that one of the things, particularly, and this speaks back in a way to what Katherine was talking about, one of the ways that, and I'm sure this isn't why she wrote about Woolf, but if you're writing in a relatively new form and you're trying you're trying out, you're experimenting, Woolf is a great person to refer to because everyone knows who she is, and she gives a sort of patina of literary respectability to a project that might otherwise be thought of as a bit too experimental, or, you know, and I don't think de Beauvoir has that same kind of cachet, at least amongst Anglo-American feminist writers. And I'm not saying that that's the way it should be, but I do think that's probably the case. There are thinkers and writers that might be reached for before de Beauvoir in a sort of feminist lineage.
Thanks. We've got a question here from Katie Cohen. Katie, if you don't mind me reading it out. She asks for Katherine, and also I do want to know if you've got the second sex on your bookshelf. So Katie asks, to what extent did you intend to be or want to be part of a new feminist politics or perspective?
I didn't intend to do anything in particular, I think, partly because, you know, when you write a book, you have absolutely no idea what's going to happen to it. And I wrote this book pretty much in its entirety before getting a publisher on board. So I had an agent and I was writing, and my agent asked me if I wanted to turn it into a book proposal and, you know, try and get a book contract there and then. And I just knew that I didn't want to do that. I knew that if I, even though that would have probably been the financially sensible thing to do, but I just knew that if I did that, if I felt the kind of the gaze and the financial investment and the psychological investment of somebody at the kind of fragile writing stage, I wouldn't be able to write it. Partly because I had no idea what I was writing. I was just writing and trying to figure out what the hell I was doing. So, you know, I didn't know what was going to happen to the book. I didn't know if a publisher was going to buy it. They did, which was great. And then, you know, it had a kind of interesting, strange, bumpy, sometimes very gratifying, sometimes very irritating journey through the world. And I don't, you know, it's very hard to know quite what to make of how a book does. because I think, you know, it was part of something, and it was part of something kind of important in terms of also opening publishers up to this kind of writing, because I've had a lot of publishers say to me, oh yeah, you know, it was really after Unmastered that we began to think we could publish this kind of writing. So, you know, I don't even know to what extent. It's very hard for me to say what I think the book did and what kind of feminist politics or landscape it's part of. You know, that's why there are people like Jen who can say very interesting and write great books about it.
I mean, it's definitely about feminism as well. It's about feminists. You know, you go and you talk about going to see famous feminist figures and how that makes you feel. You talk about you know, the feminist reactions to abortion. You talk, you know, which I don't touch on at all. There are, you know, it's definitely a book that has asking questions of feminism, and particularly contemporary feminism, and the space it has for certain types of debate and not.
Yes, and I think what's interesting is that, you know, Jen, when you spoke earlier about this eternal paradox within feminist discourse, which is that, you know, there is silence and we need to speak out against silence. And the fantasy is always that the speaking out against the silence is finally going to bring us what we want, which is people caring about the things that we're talking about, you know, be they, you know, economic inequality or abortion or rape or harassment or whatever it might be, or even, dare we say it, pleasure. You know, maybe people might also want to care about that. So, you know, it's been a constant in feminist discourse to invoke the silence as the grounds for the speech. And, you know, arguably that's worked in some ways, and arguably it really hasn't. I mean, you know, that's one of the reasons Me Too was so fascinating, because it was a kind of spectacle of speech and of the performance of refusing silence and refusing shame. And, you know, I'm not sure that it really worked that well in terms of affecting anything genuine kind of politically. But I do, so, you know, I feel very conscious of that paradox. And in the book, I suppose one of the things I was really playing with was, you know, what Foucault says when, in the History of Sexuality, when he says, what led us to show ostentatiously that sex is something we hide? Why do we say with so much passion and so much resentment that we are repressed? You know, the book was partly an exploration of the kind of thought gesture of speaking about silence, you know, writing about something when what you're saying in your writing is, this is really difficult for me to say. But, you know, you put it on the page and then someone has published it and people are talking about it. But so I think it, you know, it's really complicated, and it's always true that every woman who sort of emerges into feminist consciousness at some point has to discover that feeling and then discover the individual ways in which she's going to grapple with that tension between sort of speech and silence. So that's certainly something I was really setting out to do. I mean, you know, in my reply to that question, I didn't mean to say I don't think it's about feminist politics. So obviously, the book is like that's exactly what it's about. But in terms of, you know, what one does, like as a writer, kind of looking ahead, it's especially with that book, because I had no idea if that book would be published. I felt it was a good book and it deserved to be published, but there was absolutely no reason for me to believe that anyone would publish it. So I wasn't, you know, I wasn't writing with a kind of project of inserting myself into some scene. I mean, I felt that the scene did need that book, but it was very much an open question whether anybody would read it.
Thanks. Peter's got a couple of questions stacked up from earlier, I think.
Yes, I didn't want them to be overlooked because the conversation had moved them off the chat board. But Elizabeth, back at 10 to 7, asked, I think, a really interesting question, which is what happens to these ideas when they reach the mainstream and are absorbed into public literary discourse? And attendant to that, she says, the rapid publishing model quickly moves onto a new audacious book to market. Do you think that their audacity is diluted or reframed? I thought that was an interesting question about the change of concept with the diffusion of these ideas. Are they diluted, strengthened?
Mm-hmm. I think Catherine's talked to some of that, haven't you, Catherine? But in some respects, and I suppose it just goes back to that point I was making about silencing and speaking. I think well, I'm going to answer this slightly different way as well. There's a chapter in the new literary feminist studies that I've written on manifestos and feminist manuals. And I think if we look at, say, the feminist manual, like the Caitlin Moran How to Be a Woman type book, and there are lots of them around, and that has become a really popular feminist vehicle. And in that chapter, I'm interested in analysing the way that those books really suffer from a problem, basically. They're stuck. They repeat the same kind of thing. And they repeat the same kind of thing partly because they present feminism as a personal journey where it's your experience that teaches you to be a feminist. And they're not in dialogue with feminist thinking or activism at all. And I think and they are all published in that sort of neoliberal model of like, just this is successful, we'll just do another one, you know. So Caitlin Moran's got several that are all the same, but you know, Laurie Penny's got them too. There's a few of these kicking around, and it's often a novelist who's then written a sort of popular feminist, I've called them manuals, some other people have called them blockbuster feminist texts. And I think those, if you go onto Goodreads as well, interestingly, what you see is people going, oh, I really enjoyed this book, it was really funny, but it didn't teach me anything new. And I think that's the problem with that kind of mainstream model of publishing, of this sort of feminist manuals. What happens to more literary texts like Catherine's? I think she answered perfectly there through thinking about how publishers will then take risks with other type of writing. And what you see with the new Audacity writers that I've talked about is often like Hetty, they'll be published by a small press first and then picked up by a much bigger press later on and republished. And I think the early publications, like Catherine's, like Chris Krause's, paved a way for that kind of writing, and allowed some publishers to take slightly more risks, but often they took risks because they were published through an avant-garde press first and had presumably done well or been reviewed well or whatever. But the question was, what happens to the ideas? Well, hopefully people write books about them and people read them and people think in more complex ways about, say, vulnerability. It's difficult to I mean, we're literary theorists and writers, not large data analysts of things like Goodreads, although I think Martin Eves here, so that could be your job, Martin. We could hand that over to you. But there is a difference in trying to think about how people have responded to those ideas in a mainstream public to academically analysing the ideas that are within those books. And I'm not sure I could really answer what happens to those ideas once they get out there without some data, which I don't have. That makes sense.
If I may, there's a really great question here from Kate Armstrong. And she was saying, thanks for the lecture, Jen. I'm interested in the intersection between trauma theory and new Audacity writers. Can you say a bit more about that? Or why you chose not to use the framework of trauma theory, perhaps?
Yeah, I'm steeped in psychoanalysis. I think would be probably a good way to describe my critical background. Between the Frankfurt School and psychoanalysis is where I fall, and trauma theory. I have a slightly I'm more interested in, say, Shoshana Feldman's side of trauma theory, thinking about testimony and thinking about how do we testify to things that we think we remember that aren't necessarily the same. How do we think about the effective kind of testimony that can be given? I'm less interested in the idea that if you write it out, then you've dealt with it. This sort of scriptotherapy stuff, which I basically think is just naive. And I think that the writers who are writing about rape in my study prove that it is. You know, they come back to it again and again and again. It's not like you write about it once and it's done. Oh, that's finished. Our experiences stay with us in our present, in our memories. So yeah, I tend not to really deal with trauma theory. I do a little bit in the chapter on rape, but not all that much. I guess my models for thinking about trauma theory would come more to the Fellman and psychoanalytic side than they would the sort of classic moment of trauma theory in the 90s or late yeah, in the 90s.
Thank you. There's a question here which I think will relate to both of you, perhaps, from Stephanie Barnes, who says, I'm interested in problematic and tenuous agency, specifically regarding younger teenage girls, the sexual agency of the so-called new Lolita, and rejecting victimhood. What did the two of you think about this?
I missed one of those words, rejecting womanhood.
Victimhood.
Victimhood. Okay.
Our initial question, I think.
Yeah.
Katherine, do you want to go first?
Yeah, do you mind repeating the question?
Yes, and apologies to Stephanie if I'm misrepresenting this. She says, I'm interested in problematic and tenuous agency, specifically regarding younger or teenage girls, the sexual agency of the new Lolita, and rejecting victimhood.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends what you mean, Stephanie, by sort of problematic or tenuous agency, but I'm reading your question as being about sort of the question of who can have agency and whether we can or should be ascribing agency to people who are especially vulnerable, like children, perhaps. Anyway, so I'm not totally sure I understand the question, but I will try and answer. I mean, I think of this line from Jacqueline Rose's amazing essay about Marilyn Monroe. So it's part of her book, Women in Dark Times, and it was an LRB essay originally, I think. And she says, so it's this beautiful essay about how Marilyn Monroe has been talked about and represented, and how the kind of, you know, extraordinary literary consciousness of Marilyn Monroe and her own sort of deep kind of intellectual engagement in the world and in politics has been, of course, completely forgotten about and subjugated. But in this essay, Jacqueline Rose says that I do not find it helpful to present Marilyn Monroe, or indeed any woman, as either on top of or succumbing to her demons, as though the only options were triumph or defeat, a military language that could not have been further from her own. I just find it the most useful way of kind of problematizing the question of agency, because I think the temptation, especially because we live in a world where young women and girls, and well, not just young women, women are, you know, harassed and assaulted and patronized and minimized and disrespected, and I mean, I could go on. It's really tempting in response to that to want to almost kind of fetishize the idea either of intense vulnerability on the one hand, or of a kind of you know, strength that has overcome not just the vulnerability, but overcome the conditions of sexism and misogyny and aggression. And so we end up in a situation where we're always trying to kind of work out, like, has that woman really got agency, or does she just think she has agency, or does this person who, you know, like any other person is subject to male violence in the world, does this person have any agency with which to resist that? And I think it's sort of often really unhelpful. I mean, obviously things are different when you're talking about children, but I also find a lot of the kind of narratives that have often unfolded about things like sexual agency and, you know, the sort of preying on young girls, it's so complicated because, of course, on the one hand, you know, I mean, I remember it well, many of us probably do, being a teenage girl is horrendous because of the way you are turned into an object to be kind of manipulated by men. But the way in which we also then, as a result of that, find it really difficult to talk about the sexual desire and the exploration and the sort of, I almost don't want to use the word agency, because I think it's become one of those words which kind of doesn't brook any complexity anymore. Like, you either have agency or you don't. But the fact is, we all have agency, and we all have that agency compromised all the time, in fact, regardless of our age. So I like to think of this Jacqueline Rose quote, and to think that, in fact, it often serves to be punitive to women, to try and work out whether a woman is on top or succumbed. And, you know, that makes me think, Jen, of what you were talking about with Theo Bassani. And I mean, to me, so much amazing writing in queer theory, particularly by male queer theorists writing about gay sex, and also, you know, the ravages and the legacy of HIV, was to really question the usefulness of these terms, and to think about the kind of, you know, tremulous, kind of exciting vulnerability that is at the heart of all human encounter and all sexual encounter. And that if conditions were right, we could harness to like incredible sexual pleasure. Fortunately, vulnerability comes with danger, so that's very risky and very hard to do. But, you know, like Jen, I want to try and stay in that space of kind of psychoanalytic queer theory where you don't have agency, but that could be like a good thing. That could be something to celebrate, you know, vulnerable promiscuity. That's the utopia. Sadly, it's very difficult to achieve.
Especially in lockdown conditions. Unless you've got a house full of people that you can play with. So I guess my very quick answer to that is that I do discuss these things a little bit in relation to Mary Calloway's What Purpose Do I Serve in Your Life, and also in relation to Tracy Emin. She writes very interestingly in Strangeland about herself as a 13-year-old dancing promiscuously in a nightclub, and she actually describes it from the third person. So most of the book is in the first person, but she jumps into the third. So there are quite interesting formal ways that people are playing with things. Calloway does it particularly, and I engage with the work of Tukwin in that as well, which I'm, you know, not that happy about their work. So there's definitely something there, but I think even just the phrase "New Lolita" gives us a sense of how much this is a performance, right? It's not it's a pose, it's a stance, it's a performance, and even if that's a performance of vulnerability, it has within that agency mixed in because of that framing. Whether the actual encounter shifts out along those lines is something else. But I'm not quite sure whether we're talking about life here or whether we're talking about literature. And I would say that the life writing that I look at that discusses moments of tenuous or what you call problematic agency or new Lolitahood are very much a sort of reframing of their experience from their own perspective. And so while those situations might have involved denigrating comments or whatever, to reproduce those frames them very differently.
Great, thank you. I think we're going to have to wrap things up because we're already over time. I sense that this would be
really. Can I say really quickly?
Yeah.
Thank you very much to everyone. But I know a few people have actually like tried to chat with me personally, and I have to basically admit that I have no ability to multitask. So it was enough for me to just be able to stay on top of the conversation without being able to read chat boxes and respond, or even pick up a question and say, I would like to answer this. So if people do have questions they want to ask me, feel free to email me or contact me through Twitter, and I'll happily engage with your questions if you've got them. So I'm sorry about that. I can only do one thing at a time.
But thanks, Jen. That's really generous of you. And I think from the range of the questions and the number of different topics that are being brought up, clearly putting the two of you in conversation with one another and with all of us has inspired a lot of really kind of important and fascinating debate. And I appreciate, Katherine, it might be a little strange to have to go back 10 years in your creative time frame to remember what you were writing about, but we're also very excited about your next book. So perhaps we can pick up some of these conversations next year when that hopefully will be launched at Birkbeck. But please, can everyone just join me in thanking these two brilliant women and brilliant writers? It's been such a pleasure to host them and to listen to their thoughts about Jen's book. So virtual applause for both. And
well, thank you very, very much for giving me the opportunity. Thank you for doing such a good job of the, I don't know, like so many comments, 90, I don't know, loads of comments.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. And thank you, Caroline, for inviting me, and Catherine for being a generous interlocutor. Must be what we talked about.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Okay.
And thanks to everyone online for coming along and making this really fruitful. So take care, everybody. Stay safe, and we'll see you all soon.